Facebook. In order to limit interruptions, I ask again that everyone stay muted during the presentation. If you have questions, please submit them through the chat feature and send them to me, Lily Filler. And I will be compiling them and consolidating the questions and then asking at the end of the program, asking the questions. I want to take this opportunity to especially thank Judge Richard Gergel and Attorney Robert Rosen for graciously giving of their time and expertise during this unforgettable year. They suggested this type of program for the society since we were not able to meet in person. So I will now turn the program over to the Honorable Richard Gergel, who will introduce our wonderful guests for the program, the commission co-chairs of the Charleston 350. Take it away, Richard.
Thank you, Lily. You know, one of the guarantees that I have when lawyers bring technology to my courtroom is that it will not work. That is the one in guaranteed development. And our challenges, if you remember the first week, for those who are here, I could not get on Zoom, and we only because Susan Rosen came up with the idea of putting me on FaceTime. And then several people from out of state wanted to know who was the fool on the box. You know, that was me. And this week we've had a challenge because my dear friend Jonathan Green has not been able to get on Zoom. We think it's an internet problem, and he's going to be on by audio. And that's just, so if you know, if you hear the disembodied voice of Jonathan, you know why he is not on. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Jonathan Green. For those of you who don't have a knowledge of Jonathan's tremendous reputation as one of the nation's leading artists, Rachel, can we throw up a couple of the images of Jonathan's magnificent work?
Yep, hang on. Let me go to the beginning, sorry.
Yep, from the beginning. There you go. Of course, that is, for those of you who have some knowledge of this story, this is the opening day of the trial of Briggs versus Elliott, the first of the 4 cases that make up Brown versus Board of Education. That is, of course, in front of my courthouse, the Charleston Federal Courthouse, and that is the massive crowd that appeared that day. Jonathan has captured this picture. It now sits in the offices of at least 100 federal judges and hundreds of lawyers across the United States as an iconic image of American justice. We'll go to the next one, go through a couple of these. There we go. These stunning images of Jonathan, for those of you who are familiar with it. The colors, the capturing of the dignity of his subjects, seeing them as individuals, as talented, capable people. It's just a stunning work, and that is a little bit of Jonathan's artistic work. Jonathan, are you able to hear us now?
Yes, I can.
Very good, Jonathan. In just a moment, we'll come back to you. I just want to make sure you were on. And Jonathan is the co-chair of the Charleston 350th Committee. He does that he chairs that with Peter Shahid, a member of Charleston City Council. Peter, are you there with us?
I'm here, Judge.
Good. Peter is a man of many talents. He is the go-to person everybody goes to on City Council when they need anything done, even though they don't live in his district. My wife and he is also the president of the Charleston Bar. He's one of the national lay leaders of the Catholic Church. And that will, and part of the interesting thing that when I note that the co-chairs of the Charleston 350 Committee are an African-American and a Catholic, 2 groups that were really not treated well in the early history of Charleston. And I think it speaks volumes that the city, in attempting to be candid and honest about its history, has selected 2 people who are not only very knowledgeable about the history of the city, but have something very important to say about the future of the city. And we're going to talk about that today because we spent a lot of time at the Jewish Historical Society talking about the notable history of religious tolerance of Charleston, and it undoubtedly was true. But at the same moment that Jews were being tolerated and allowed to open synagogue and a synagogue and to practice their faith, Catholics were barred from the colony for many early years. African Americans came in chains. West Africans were horribly treated. All this is happening simultaneously. Robert, if you could just give us a little bit of brief history of that early Charleston Jewish experience.
Rachel, you're going to put up the slides, right?
Yep, you ready?
I'm ready. So I think this is a familiar story to most everyone in this audience, but there are people who are not familiar with it. As Richard and I have discussed earlier, this is John Locke, who wrote the Fundamental Constitution of the Carolinas in 1669. And we loved the quote in the document. It was not exactly a legal constitution, but it sort of set the legal framework of the colony of Carolina, and it granted religious freedom to, quote, Jews, heathens, and other dissenters. And of course, this was an extremely unusual document because it's really the first time that a government actually granted religious toleration in a fundamental document to Jews. And of course, South Carolina alone of the American colonies, except for a period in Rhode Island's history, allowed Jews the freedom to practice their religion. Rachel, we're going to move on. So this is John Locke, and that's how the story began. You know, the people who came, we know this familiar story of the Sephardic Jews who were run out of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, settled in Europe, various parts of Europe. And actually the people who came in the early years spoke Portuguese, Spanish. Some came from Germany, some came from, it was a mixture of people. But the first synagogue the congregation is 1749. Jews were allowed to have their own synagogue. This is the original Beth Elohim. And it was Orthodox and Sephardic. Next slide. This is a drawing of the building about 1812. Next. This is a picture of a member of the congregation. I just wanted to show you what some of these people look like. You know, what's funny about this program is the Jews in this story are not the victims. You know, we're not talking about the Jews being oppressed. We're talking about the Jews being part of the establishment. So the Catholics couldn't come into the colony. They weren't allowed to practice their religion. African Americans were enslaved. Meanwhile, the Jews are accepted by society. So this is a story in which the roles are not always what you might think. Next slide. This is the interior of KKBE. You see it's a Sephardic synagogue modeled on the synagogue in London. And this was an Orthodox Sephardic congregation. Of course, this building burns down by the fire in Anson-Bar, and a new building is erected. Rachel? Once again, not only do they have congregations, houses, affluence, jobs, political freedom, they create colonial benevolent societies. I mean, they're really part of the community. As Dale Rosengarten used that quote for her, for the exhibition that was done years ago, A Portrait of the People, there are a portion of the people. And so these are the Jews assimilated into colonial South Carolina. Rachel? I couldn't have a program without paying homage to Sally Breitbart, one of our great founders, but I was looking for the Cumming Street Cemetery. I had a talk with a historian at one point, the American Jewish Historical Society. He said the Cumming Street Cemetery is the Plymouth Rock of Jewish America. It's one of the oldest, I mean, after Truro, it's the oldest cemetery in America, Jewish cemetery. Next slide. This is the Hebrew Orphan Society. So this is the affluence of the Jews of early Carolina that they built this building on Broad Street. Rachel? This is the home of Moses Levy, who was the president of the congregation on East Bay, still standing today. Next slide. I just wanted to show this because a lot of people don't know this. When KKB had the big fight over the organ, the Orthodox left the Reform and they formed, as you might expect, the remnant of Israel, Shearith Israel, on Wentworth Street. That building stood in the 20th century. I think the site is now a Catholic convent. Next slide. And I'm going to end on Moses Cohen Mordecai and Isabel Lyon Mordecai. I know he looks a little like Kramer in the Seinfeld episode, but he was actually the state senator from Charleston County in 1850. So the Jews of early Carolina, by the 1850s, the state senator of Charleston, this is when senators really were somebody. And of course, his name was Moses Cohen Mordecai. He was president of the temple. So he wasn't masquerading as an Episcopalian. This is his wife, Isabel Lyons, who's Richard, was her uncle the mayor of Columbia?
It's actually his sister, isn't it?
This sister, the mayor of Columbia. So this is the Jewish community of early Carolina.
Yep.
Right. Thank you.
Excellent, Robert. Jonathan, you have spent years talking about the role of rice in the early success of the Carolina colony and the role of West Africans in teaching Europeans what basically became the initial mainstay of the economy of the Carolina colony. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, you would have to begin in West Africa when the Portuguese sailed down the coast of West Africa around 1200. And they were looking for gold. And they saw these miles and miles of golden fields, which were rice fields. Well, the rice was the major and staple economy of West Africa. And the Europeans that left Europe and went down to Barbados, they were farmers, and they sort of wiped out the Indians and brought in the West Africans. But to farming, there is no way you can have what we often speak of as a bunch of slaves to put in one of the largest man-made earthen sculptures on the planet. And those are the rice fields of Carolinas. So you are talking about people that must have been brought, or came here, then brought here as contractors to put in these rice fields. Europeans could not have done it, so we know that. The clearing of the fields could not have been done without the help of the West Africans. So the important part of the Low Country Rice Culture Project is to establish the fact that if we want to talk about people, we really need to talk about the value of the economics of people. And the value and the economics of the West African has been unbelievable, in Charleston having been the wealthiest city for well over 100 years between 1760 and 1860-65, the wealthiest city. And that was based mostly on the agriculture economy of rice. So to put into perspective, when we're talking about history and culture and economics of the Carolinas, we have to talk about what really made it what it is, what really made the peninsula what it was, and those were the rice barons.
And Jonathan, then what about the West African contribution to physical Charleston, the structure we celebrate today, the buildings and so forth?
When we look at the population of West Africans in Charleston, it was easily between 40 and 60%. If you have a population of that size, which were mainly the work staff, then they would have influenced every aspect of the culture from that period of time, including cooking, medicinal, music, games, craftsmanship. When you look at the great plantation houses and you look at the fabulous homes on this peninsula and all the masonry work, the coopers, I mean, everything imaginable, because they were the workload. The peninsula was not a place for a middle-class person, only if you had a small business. The workload was that of West African and African-American people. So walking through the peninsula of Charleston is like walking through a living museum for me, and it should be for anyone else, in terms of the contributions of West African people rather than the contributions of enslaved people.
Yes, and a lot of your art, you're depicting these as real people, as
an artist,
living
I'm doing
people of dignity and accomplishment.
As an artist, I'm doing what almost any rural artist or artist who has a love and a respect for their home where they came from, painting the realism as you knew it, certainly as I knew it as a child, and having the skills to do it. It's one thing to be an artist and to reflect on one's history and culture. It's another thing to have the talent and have craftsmanship to do it. So therein puts in a different light to Rice. And when the Gibbs Museum was so gracious in allowing me to have a posthumous show of my paintings of Rice and the works of Ms. Alice Avenel, Hugh G. Smith, it showed what would have America looked like if West African people were allowed to be people with their freedom and dignity, just like everyone else. I think one of the major misconceptions is that many of the Europeans that came to America in droves after much of the work had been done by African Americans, they were slaves also. I mean, they certainly didn't have much of anything. I mean, the land was totally destroyed for the most part, and people were starving all over the place. Potato famine is a great example of that. And that happened continuously. So, you know, for African American people, they look at this country from the perspective of giving class distinction for everyone else and referring to African people as slaves. That's just not true. If we want to talk about people as slaves, then let's talk about the adults that brought them over as children, because that's how they came over here. Most of them, 80% of the enslaved people that were brought here were middle school and high school age children. And when they were brought here, they already had a system in place of elder Africans to train them as in nurseries, to educate them about rice culture and how to work in the fields. It doesn't take a brain scientist to figure out what happens when people are removed. Their cultures have been taken away from them, and they have been silenced. And the silencing great part was the removal of the drums, when Africans could not beat their own drums to communicate. So, I mean, it is a place of great beauty, but major horrificness happened here. And I think it would be a much healthier note if we would think in terms of the children that were removed from West Africa to where even today, ancestry of families still protect the graves from the 17 and 1800s that were the graves to hold the soul of the dead that never return. So in doing all of this research in Rice, it really made me far more human to understand both sides, the sides of the people that were enslaved and the side of the people that were the slavers. And right now we're at a very delicate moment in our history and culture, with not only with COVID, but with Black Lives Matter and celebrating this 350. And Peter will tell you that our celebration of 350 is exactly what we're doing now with the Gibbs Museum Vibrant Vision show of art, with having these opportunities to really think about the culture and the people and the contributions of all people. I think that's the one great note that Charleston should really start celebrating. It's
it is, and I think it's a remarkable part of the 350 celebration. Peter, let's talk a little bit about the Catholic experience.
All right. Thank you all. I'm gonna go to my share screen, and thank you all very much for the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon. And I think I screwed up. Hang on one second. Let me go back.
By the way, if I disappear for a moment, there's some security device on my court computer that may take me out for a minute. So if I disappear, you know where I went. I'll be back.
Okay.
Technology. Go ahead, Peter.
All right. Wait 1 second. Let me get to my my proper screen, and I'm not.
You should go share screen and then.
Yep, I am. I just had something just popped up that I need to fix. So give me 1 second.
Take your time.
All right, here we go. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit with you this afternoon about the Charleston 350, and Jonathan gave me a good lead into all of this. So this year we were going to celebrate the 350th anniversary of the founding of Charleston, or the colony Charlestown, and this was our mission statement. In 2020, the city of Charleston will commemorate the 350th anniversary of the historic founding of Charlestown by engaging the community And the state of South Carolina honored the city's rich heritage, unique customs, and diverse cultures in a manner that examines its past and present in setting the course for its future as a 21st century global city. And it's important to note, and as Judge Gergel mentioned to you, that the idea behind commemorating the 350th anniversary was to really tell the full and complete story of Charleston. It's different peoples, it's different cultures, it's different religions. And so we're talking a little bit today about religious intolerance, and I just wanted to share this with you, the origin of my name, and I can come back to this a little bit later, but the origin of my name is that of a martyr. And so understanding religious intolerance is something very personal to me that I can tie back into all of this later on as I go through through this presentation. So as Robert has mentioned, and as Jonathan has alluded to, Charlestown was founded in 1670. I live West Ashley, Charlestown Landing, the original location of the Carolina colonies. And it's important to note that Charlestown Landing was an English colony. And so when the colonists came over here in 1670, they were very much engaged as an English settlement. And that means they brought with them their English customs, they brought with them their English laws, their English habits, and their English traditions, and their English religion. And you sort of coupled with that, before you had in the 15th century or early part of the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation. So there was this fuss between England and the Pope. And the Pope was seen as the individual who was in charge of the Catholic Church, the Universal Catholic Church. King Henry VIII was head of the Church of England. So all things secular and all things political, he was the big cheese. He was the guy who was in charge of everything. And so when the English colonists came over here, and as Richard referred to, they had with them this body of law that was never really enacted, but was practiced, which is called the Fundamental Constitution. It set out the groundwork for governing this early colony. And in the backdrop of that, you had the Act of Supremacy, which meant that if you wanted to hold public office, you had to swear allegiance to the king, and you had to renounce by other sort of acts and things that you were not going to be loyal to anybody but the king, particularly you weren't going to be the Pope. One of these was the 1690 legislation that actively outlawed Catholicism. And so you couldn't be a Catholic and come to the English colony at the time. The Diocese of Charleston is celebrating its 200th anniversary, which means there's 150 years when the Catholic diocese was not even in existence. There were some Catholics who were coming here thanks to the French and the Spanish, but Catholics and those who were enslaved were outcasts of some sort. They did not have full religious freedom. They did not have freedom to express themselves. Part of that was created because of this dual feeling that there were Catholic agents who would come in to try to overthrow the King of England. So the first real footprint of Catholicism starts with St. Mary's of the Annunciation Church. This is the bill that got the ball rolling in 1789. This is St. Mary's Catholic Church on Hazel Street, which is ironically
our neighbor.
Your neighbor.
Yes.
So there was a kindred spirit between Catholics and Jews in the Charleston community because I think we all felt sort of the same sting from time to time, even though Jews were given much more freedom than Catholicism coming into the existence of the early colony. Our first bishop was John England. He was born in Cork, Ireland. He was a lawyer by trade, interesting enough. He was ordained in 1820 as a bishop of Charleston. And the Diocese of Charleston encompassed all of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. So it was really interesting. We had this vast geographic region that John England was trying to accomplish. And he was very much anti-King of England. He renounced his citizenship and became an American citizen later on in life. There were several things that John England may be noted for. He was very instrumental in creating, and I'll come back to this in a second, schools for Blacks. But the one thing that he was very strong on was defending the Catholic faith. In 1825, in Christmas of 1825, he was at St. Patrick's Church in Washington, D.C., specifically to respond to a presentation given by John Quincy Adams, who talked about an anti-Catholic speech that was given 4 years earlier. John Quincy Adams was then president of the United States. He attended that service and heard Bishop John England fillet him about what he talked about was anti-Catholicism talked. He invited him over for dinner a couple of days later. And then later on, he, in January of 1826, is the first Catholic cleric to address the House of Representatives, which is pretty incredible that this fella from little old Charleston, South Carolina, who forms an early diocese in 1820, is the first Catholic cleric. And he talks about John Quincy Adams' discussions about being Catholic is anti-democracy. And you all may remember this fella. His name was John F. Kennedy. When John F. Kennedy ran for president, he had to denounce that he was going to be ruled by the Pope. And historians have talked about John England's address to Congress in 1826 as the foundation for John Kennedy's speech. If you give me 1 second, I'll read a portion of that. This is his address, Candidate Kennedy, in September of 1960 in Houston, Texas. And he is renouncing that he's going to be aligned with the Pope. And he says this: I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source, where no religious body speaks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all. So it's just remarkable. In 1960, you almost have to share this idea of Catholic feeling that you could be loyal to the Pope, to the American population. So the anti-Catholic feeling is still very much alive and well. Going back to John England, he created this order of nuns called the Our Lady of Mercy, with one of the main purposes was to provide free education to the Black population. He later got, there was a riot that broke out in Charleston, and he had to shut down those schools and in the preservation of free education to both free and enslaved Blacks. This doesn't really talk a whole lot about religious tolerance or intolerance in the state of South Carolina or the Diocese of Charleston, but I did have to talk to you a little bit about this person. This was the third bishop of Charleston. His name is Patrick Lynch. He was a slaveholder. Here he is seen in April of 1861 visiting the fortifications at Fort Sumter. He is later appointed by this guy, the president of the Confederacy, to be a special emissary to the Vatican to try to get Vatican support and to meet with Pope Pius to get the Vatican to fund the Confederate cause. The Pope doesn't like that. and he gives him what's called the stole and mitre. It says, "Go home, young man, and God bless you." I thought it was kind of interesting that a bishop was trying to get financial support from the Holy See. Anyhow, the Catholics in South Carolina had a rough go on it, and but their influence in Charleston after the American Revolution, which sort of paves the way for John England coming to Charleston in 1820, is directly attributable to the amount of support that the French have with the American Revolution, to sort of opening up this idea of Catholic tolerance into the Americas. And so you have this surgence of Catholics coming into South Carolina, doing Bishop Lynch's tenure with the American Constitution and even the South Carolina Constitution, now affirming religious tolerance. There's a huge influx of Irish Catholics coming into Charleston. And then their power certainly starting to be flexed a little bit. You're all familiar with the institutions of St. Francis Hospital, the Knights of Columbus, and of course, Bishop England High School. So you have this huge influx of Catholics and of their responsibility and their engagement, particularly with the 1969 hospital strike. This is Monsignor Tom Duffy, who's shown here. I love what's behind him, Beatles Power sign. But the Catholic Church was very much engaged in support of the hospital workers at the American University, trying to get them fair wages back in 1969. The sting of the late involvement of Catholics in South Carolina, this sort of gives you a little bit of a graphic. There's close to 5 million people who live in the state of South Carolina. We're about 5%, we're about less than 10% of that, close to 500,000. I think the huge influx of folks coming in from the Hispanic region has increased that. This I thought was an interesting story. I'm going to talk about John Grace in a minute, Robert, because you won't let me get out of here without talking about John Grace. But here is the Catholic influence in Charleston. Joseph P. Riley, good Irish Catholic young man, is mayor of the city of Charleston for 40 years. Little known fact that at one point, the mayor of Isle of Palms, the mayor of Mount Pleasant, and the mayor of Sullivan's Island are all Catholic. 3 of those 4 were raised in Charleston. Some of them went to Bishop England High School. But it's just amazing to me that we have an Irish Catholic who is controlling the city from the mayor's office for 40 years, and the other influence.
And Peter, that election of Joe Riley in 1975 was with a coalition of the dispossessed, the Jews, the African Americans, and the Catholics got together and took over the city.
And that leads to this other fellow named John P. Grace, who wrote such an interesting story. So John Grace was also a lawyer. He graduated from Georgetown Law School, became very much involved in national politics and movements around the country that caught his attention. He won this huge case in 1907 regarding, you still had back then people who were sent to debtor's prison. And so he won this case to eliminate debtor's prison. And this is a quote or a statement made by the judge in the case called Ex parte Drayton. And this is what Judge William Brawley said of Grace in that decision. Their case has been brought here by a young member of the bar, himself belonging to a race that in the past has suffered through centuries of injustice and oppression, whose heart has been touched by the dry of the lowly, and who apparently as his own cost from sheer love of liberty and hatred of wrong, makes this appeal for the liberty to which they are entitled under every sanction of the Constitution and the laws of our country. John Grace he ran for mayor 4 times. He won the first time in 1911, lost the second time in 1915. It was a shootout, I think, at the OK Corral. One person was killed in that shootout. He's conceded the race, and then he won again in 1919. But it was exactly what you just mentioned, Judge Gergel. It was a coalition of.
Listen, somebody is speaking. Please mute. We're hearing people's voices. Could someone please mute their phone, please? Please, Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, so it was the coalition back in 1911 included the Jews and the Catholics and those who felt on the margins of society in Charleston to get John Grace elected. And then, of course, comes Joe Raleigh, and so the exact same coalition took place with him when he ran in 1975.
Let me ask this. Okay, I make the point. Jonathan, I'm gonna direct this to you. You still with us, Jonathan?
Yes, yes.
Tell me, here's this remarkable history of Charleston, I mean, the treatment of West Africans is one of the great shames, maybe the original sin of America. And then the history of anti-Catholicism is a major theme of early Charleston. So here you are, you and Peter end up as the chairs of the committee. What does that say, and what does that tell us about where we want to go in the future?
Well, I think there's nothing left but resolve. I think Peter and I have a wonderful opportunity based on the people that know us, and they're very supportive of what we're doing together. We are entering this grand opportunity of celebrating 350 with open hearts and open minds. We both are avid readers. We understand history. We both have traveled. And when you have done those things, you know that this is nothing new. History often repeats itself because most people do not read. And when they read, they don't really comprehend what's going on. And so they can apply it to the moment, to time, to now. The situation with Black Lives Matter, it's only because the younger people are getting together in forces to say, based on how they have been educated by their parents, this is injustice. This is not right what's happening to young Black men. And they're saying something about it. Collectively, they're saying something about it. So all these things happening, I see it's an opportunity for great change. With the Gibbs Museum having Vibrant Visions, the exhibition, it's an opportunity for people for the very first time to understand in this country that under the administration of President and Mrs. Roosevelt, they acted on pretty much the same thing we're doing, finding ways to make America a better place for everybody. And that exhibition showcases the first time women could actually sign their names on their own work and be represented and respected in museums and galleries. It was also the first time that an African American could paint his or her own face or image and sign it and have it accepted as legitimate pieces of art. So that was back in the 30s. Then we went through civil rights movement. The problem is when you don't have the art to act as a lens, a camera to the various of history and all its atrocities, people forget. And we are caught in a moment of forgetfulness. And it is the younger people whom have the opportunity to Google and to get information in their lap, if you will, in terms of anything they might want to know or ask without having to go through a series of books. The information is readily available. They are just shocked and surprised. And when I give tours at that museum, the look on the faces of women to realize that they were first respected as artists in the 30s. So this is it's a moment of reconciliation for everybody. I think people have to really think about whom they are, where they are, and what are they going to contribute to make it better.
Well, one of the realities that Jewish people as well as Catholics struggle with is that some of our brethren of an era where there was slavery were slaveholders. Frederick Douglass would travel the country, the great abolitionist would travel the country and denounce organized religion for its hypocrisy, believing in the Exodus, but then nonetheless, and supporting slavery. Peter, yeah, I know that the church had to go through this, correct? With
Yeah, exactly. And so John England, as well educated as he was, tolerated slavery in Charleston, and Bishop Lynch inherited slaves, and he used them. So they tolerated, and then of course I talked to you about him going over to Rome, to the Holy See, to get support from the Vatican. After Reconstruction, the Catholic Church was very segregated. They created this school called the Immaculate Conception School that had for Blacks only from the first grade through high school. And several prominent Black members of our community went through that school, graduated from that school. And Catholic schools were not integrated until Bishop Undercuffley came in the mid-1960s, which created a huge schism among Catholics. The nerve of them integrating Catholic schools and getting rid of Immaculate Conception as a separated school for Blacks. And so it's a twisted history in which the Sisters of Charity of Our Lady of Mercy were there to educate Blacks, but it was a sort of the separate but equal kind of mentality that was very prominent in the Catholic Church.
Well, and Robert, you've written about this whole role of Jews trying to reconcile slavery, and then being active in the civil rights movement in the 60s, and this sort of conflict between these different views of Judaism.
Yeah, I think that the Catholics and the Jews both shared the same problem, is that they wanted to be part of the mainstream, and they wanted to be accepted by the majority. They didn't want to cause trouble because they were minorities themselves. And so, it's not something to look back on that, we wish that the Catholic Church, and we wish that the Jewish congregations had done something about slavery. We wish, but it wasn't to be in the South. And then in the civil rights movement, I think the Catholic Church gets a few more gold stars. I think the leadership of the Catholic Church is certainly in the South is out there. I think
there are a lot of priests and a lot of rabbis. Peter, can you take down your PowerPoint if you could?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. The priests and the rabbis are. In fact, in a lot of these small Jewish communities, these small communities across the South, there's a lot of controversy when the Jewish merchants are having to explain to their neighbors that why these rabbis and priests, I'm sure the local Catholics had the same experience, but they were, the horrible murder of the civil rights workers in Mississippi were, 2 Jewish kids and an African-American kid.
Right. Well, the Jewish community, wasn't one of our proudest moments. It would have been better. It would be nice to think that people would have been more brave, but we can all look back and wish we had done more. I think that the Catholics and the Jews and other minorities, the South was the unforgiving place back in the days of segregation. So it took a special kind of bravery to stand up.
Yeah. I think part of the 350th anniversary committee is to look at these different, to be honest about our past, and this history of religious tolerance. And it was not just, though Catholics were excluded, it did include Unitarians, Quakers, Baptists, who were then dissenters from the Anglican Church, and others. And Methodists, right? Methodism was grew up because of in South Carolina, and Charleston was a centerpiece for that because of its tradition of religious tolerance.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that mainstream Protestant denominations that we think of as being in charge, being large and in charge, were not always that way. James Madison comes to the whole concept of religious liberty by defending Baptists in colonial Virginia who were being persecuted by the Church of England and the majority. The Baptists were a persecuted minority at one point, and the Methodists were also persecuted because they didn't like slavery. So, but Charleston, I will say this, I do think Catholics are an exception because they were fighting with the British, and that was an international issue, you know, bigger than the state of South Carolina. I mean, the war between the Vatican and the Protestants is a little bigger than South Carolina. But the truth is, South Carolina, the Anglicans ruled sort of lightly. I mean, they allowed the Baptists, they allowed the Jews, they eventually allowed the Catholics. So I think South Carolina's got a pretty good record on religious liberty.
Yeah, and you know, one of the ideas can well be that that as we look back on this history, this complicated history, you know, complicated history, that we can say this tradition of religious tolerance can be a model for our future, or one of our better angels. And that we found that as a result of tolerance, our community thrived. And perhaps the future, that is a model for our future. Peter,
Judge,
what's your thought about that?
So it's kind of interesting what Robert and you are talking about, because when you heard about learned about the Denmark Basic riot, they attribute that, the Charlestonians attribute that riot to the Methodists and to the Catholics being engaged in that. And from the French refugees from Haiti, they blamed the Catholics and Methodists for that riot. But then, you know, if you coming into the 21st century, it's quite interesting on a national level that we now have 6 members of the Supreme Court who are Catholic. And they're pretty staunch Catholic. I mean, they are very conservative minded. As Scalia was probably one of the harshest minded Catholics on the bench during his tenure. And so now we're going to have coming up real soon these issues of the affordable health care and abortion. And so here's this turnaround with Catholics gaining this national power on the Supreme Court. And so issues coming before them is going to be questioned as to their teachings, their beliefs, how that's going to influence decisions coming down the pike up on the national level. It's kind of this turnaround because, as Robert mentioned, this was this international fight between Rome and the British Empire, and the king is the supreme head of the church, and so you had this fight going on. It really was trying to keep Catholics out of the American colonies. And then the Baptists were coming in, and then the Quakers were coming in. Those other sort of so-called fringe groups were allowed more tolerance than Catholics because of this trust with them.
But we're getting ready to have a great addition to our community cultural institution, which is the International African American Museum.
Yep.
And it is going to spawn a dialogue, not just in Charleston, but we're going to, you know, it's going to be a hub of tourism, and particularly in often African American tourism to Charleston. 1 in 4 African Americans trace their family roots to the port of Charleston. So, you know, we're going to continue this conversation, and I know that part of the effort of the 350 committee was to help spur this dialogue and to talk about, be honest about our past, to acknowledge that past, and to try to shape a different future. Correct? I mean,
correct. Absolutely. That's the whole purpose of what we're doing here tonight. If I can make one plug, it's a very detailed book, but the Dawn of Religious Freedom in South Carolina. It is very technical, but it gives you beautiful insight. Really does give a beautiful insight into religious tolerance or intolerance in South Carolina. There's an
Well, let me ask you this, Peter. Does it mention? But is the book good for the Jews?
I think it's fair across the board, Robert. That's a problem. It is what it is.
yeah.
I think one of the chapters might have been written by Belinda and Richard Gergel, I think.
I think more Belinda than Richard. I'm not sure about that.
Well, Lily, do we have any questions?
Yeah, there's one that I think has come across from a lot of people, and I'd like to hear from all four of you as you answer. I think Mr. Green gave a very good explanation of why Black Lives Matter has now come on the scene, how the young look at it a little bit different than perhaps their parents. But the question is, what do you see going forward with all of the racial injustice, protests, riots that we've been seeing over the last 6-8 months? I'd like to hear from each of you. How do you see this tolerance projecting over the different groups that we've talked about today, both among themselves and between themselves? And Jonathan Green, I'd like to start with you.
Oh boy. Well, I think what we have entered is probably one of the most important periods of this century, because we are locked in between two major happenings that are Black Lives Matter and COVID-19. And it is an opportunity for a real pause in terms of our seniors to reflect on what their attitudes and missions have been, because it has to be answered in some capacity for our younger people. And our younger people can only do so much. They can only activate things, get things started. But we here, as in 350 with my co-chair, Shahid, we are really trying to have an opportunity for people to be able to ask these questions, get the information, and also to put out the historical information on as much of an accuracy of his story as possible, and to inject in his story, her story, and the story of all other people.
Peter, what are your thoughts?
Well, God, it's hard following Jonathan, but so here we are, and I'm going to answer sort of from a City of Charleston perspective, a member of City Council. So here we are apologizing for slavery, the removal of the John C. Calhoun statute, which was very controversial, riots on Marion Square, and then these cries for defunding the police at the same time. And so it's just it's like we're coming from different angles all at the same time in trying to drink water out of a fire hose right now, to absorb all of this and take it in, and to sort of filter through the noise to see where we're going to end up. Clearly, and Judge, I mean, you see it in your courtroom. I see it as a criminal defense lawyer. We do come across these instances of disparity. And the City of Charleston Police Department just went through a racial bias audit. So we know it exists out there, and it's a problem. And I think you just have to deal with it head on, and grab it by the horns and wrestle with it. And don't be afraid of it.
Well, Peter, first of all, we've got to acknowledge the problem, right?
We've got to acknowledge the problem, that it exists, it's there, and it's very much alive.
Robert, what are your thoughts?
Well, I hate to inject politics into a historical conversation, but I do think the presidential election is going to determine a lot of what's going to happen. And I can say it, and it might be more difficult for the judge to say it, but you know, I just think this country needs to calm down and get back. I mean, you know, I was reading the New York Times today, and you know, they said we thought there was a floor on bad behavior, but it turned out there really wasn't. And so I'm putting all my chips on Joe Biden. So I'm hoping that we're going to go back to some sense of normalcy, and that these grievances can be addressed in a fair and even-handed manner. I realize it's not really appropriate to talk about politics, but to answer the question, I just don't see how the country can calm down without some leadership from the top.
And
I hope that
Richard,
doesn't affect our taxes.
before you answer, Richard, Robert, I do have a question specifically for you. When you were showing the Hebrew Benevolent Society seal, there was an image of the Grim Reaper. Can you kind of clarify that for us?
Yeah, I think it started as a burial society. So, you know, a lot of people don't realize this. The Jewish the first Jewish organizations in most of of America, where they first created a society, was in Hebrew. I can't say the Hebrew name right, but it's was essentially a burial society. So
Right, that's the
Yeah.
pattern in virtually every city.
right, so that people could be buried in a proper Jewish cemetery. And so I think that seal is very interesting. I wanted to just show it. There's a whole book on the Hebrew Benevolent Society and the Hebrew Orphan Society. Tommy Tobias wrote a book on it, and I got that picture from that. Yeah.
And
the,
Richard, I'm going to have you kind of sum it all up for us.
Well, I just think the reason we wanted to have this conversation and not just celebrate the tolerance that Jews experience, but to acknowledge the history and suffering of other peoples, was to help us see this model of the tolerance towards Charleston's tolerance towards its Jewish citizens as maybe a North Star for the city's future. That it can show tolerance and inclusiveness and opportunity for all of our citizens. So for that, Lily, I give it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our guests tonight, Peter, Jonathan, and certainly Robert and Richard. On December 3rd, I'd like to announce that the Charleston Jewish Book Fest is presenting Wandering Dixie, Dispatches from the Lost South by Sue Eisenfeld. It's presented by the Pearlstein-Lipoff Center of Southern Jewish Culture, KKBE, Lifelong Learning, and the College of Charleston Jewish Studies. If you're interested, please register at thejewishhistoricalsociety.org. We are already busy preparing for our multiple series of Sunday conversations for 2021. If you have a recommendation or a topic that you'd like to have discussed, please send it to Rachel Barnett, or you can send it to me. Also, I would encourage everyone to please become a member of the Jewish Historical Society. This is what we want to do for you. We want to tell your history. Visit the Jewish Historical Society, southcarolina.org, or visit our Facebook page. All Zoom links can be found on our Facebook page and in our newsletters. Finally, please remember to vote, be safe, and until next time, Gai Gesundheit. Good night.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
everybody.
Thank you all. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you all. We'll
Thanks,
talk
Thank you,
soon.
Jonathan. Thank you,
Thanks,
Peter.
everybody.
thank
Take
you.
care.
Very well.
Bye.
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 Bye.